At the end of the 1800s, the United States was rapidly expanding west in a push to make land for homesteading available to white citizens and, to a lesser degree, African American citizens recently freed from slavery. The seemingly unstoppable growth posed a problem harder and harder to ignore. What was to be done with the Native Americans? Our relations with the Indians located within our border impose upon us responsibilities we cannot escape. Every effort should be made to lead them through the paths of civilization and education to self-supporting and independent citizenship. In 1883, on a small patch of Cherokee land near the border of Kansas in what was then known as Indian Territory, crews began construction on the Chilocco Indian Agricultural School. The first federally run school for natives in Indian Territory, Chilocco would be charged with remaking generations of Native Americans in the image of the white man. The complicated legacy of the school would forever change the generations that passed beneath Chilocco's gates for the next 100 years. On January 15, 1884, 150 Native students entered Chilocco Indian Agricultural School's inaugural class. The imposing limestone facility would become the leading institution for Native agricultural studies in the region. The agricultural aspect of Chilocco was especially important because the vast majority of Americans still lived on farms. Farming was seen as the key to a civilized lifestyle, a tool for amplifying the assimilation of Native Americans.
When students arrived at Chilocco in the early days, often by wagon, so the first superintendent would go out to Cheyenne, Kiowa, Arapahoe. They would bring students back. Students were divested of their what were called home clothes. They were issued, government-issued GI clothing and uniforms, often numbered. Scrubbed down, usually with kerosene. The idea was to kill lice. They'd be fine combed with kerosene. Haircuts, often in a not very, shall we say, nurturing environment or way.
Sitting on over 8,000 acres of rich farmland, the original Chilocco building stood as a physical testament to the ideals the government wished to imbue in Native students. Chilocco was modeled after the Carlisle Indian School, established just 5 years earlier in Pennsylvania. Built out of a former prison barracks, the school had been founded by Richard Henry Pratt, a captain in the United States Army with a long history of fighting in the Indian Wars. A great general has said that the only good Indian is a dead one. In a sense, I agree with that sentiment, but only in this: that all the Indian there is in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him and save the man.
And so his idea at Carlisle was to provide that kind of opportunity for Native people to learn white society, to learn trades, to learn a profession.
Pratt's vision of a civilized red man echoed popular public sentiment surrounding the Indian problem. Short of the proposed solution of complete Native genocide, the United States government began to forge a series of assimilation policies aimed at bringing the Indian closer to the white way of life. The General Allotment Act, also known as the Dawes Act, enacted in 1887, was such a policy. Under Dawes, communally held tribal lands were seized for redistribution as individually owned land parcels. To proponents of the act, individual land ownership was viewed as an effective means to breaking up tribal communities. The introduction of individualistic values into tribal groups was seen as key to bringing civilization to the natives. Schools like Chilocco deliberately fit into this assimilation plan. Located far from the communities most of the children were taken from, Chilocco was run on a militaristic model. The students were organized in military companies and would march in double file from place to place, their daily routine organized by 22 bugle calls. Half a day in the classroom, half a day on work detail, often very repetitive elementary labor. Much of the day-to-day maintenance of the school was attended to by the children, and work on the farm was designed to train the natives to take care of their allotments. Girls were trained to cook, clean, and mend clothing.
Congressional appropriations were never sufficient to cover costs, so that student labor was absolutely essential to both building the schools and then maintaining them, keeping them running, feeding the student body. Even when Chilocco was a high school in the 30s, that might have been the equivalent of 6th, 7th, possibly 8th grade education in the public schools at that time. Well, what we have to remember about the schools is that there was a particular federal agenda, erase and replace Indianness, but the school was populated by human beings. I mean, these Indian kids, young people, they weren't all, young children, young adults up to early 20s, so anywhere from 5 years old to 23, who were smart, tough in many cases, resilient, intelligent, determined to be individual people. Certainly they went through many traumas and great diversity of experience.
One distinct aspect of Chilocco was its diverse tribal makeup. Though the school was established inside Indian territory, enrollment during the early years consisted primarily of students entering from neighboring Oklahoma territory. It wasn't until 1910 that students hailing from the 5 so-called civilized tribes were allowed to attend. As time went on, the student body came to represent over 40 separate native nations.
Some were heritage language speakers with limited or no English. Others came to Chilocco as English as a first language speakers. Some came to Chilocco by the 1920s from a second or third generation enrollment in boarding schools. Some came in as second or third generation Baptists or Catholics. Others came from native ceremonial religious traditions.
Much of the students' day-to-day lives were organized around tribal groupings based in part upon kinship, shared language and tribal affiliation, and/or notions of mixed or full-blood identity.
Those were important categories to Chilocco students, and that sorted the way people got along or didn't get along. Many alums talk about Chilocco as, this very interesting ground where people met folks native people they wouldn't have otherwise met, enduring friendships, some enduring hostilities, a lot of marriages across tribal lines there.
The grounds of the school contained a cemetery. Families of students who passed away while at Chilocco would oftentimes receive a form letter with news that their child had died. The school communicated news of the deaths to the Bureau of Indian Affairs as well. Sir, I have the honor to report the death this morning of Marion Cadman, a Navajo girl aged 12 years who has been a pupil of the Chilocco School. The cause of her death was quick consumption. Everything was done for her that skill, science, and sympathy could do. The corpse was buried in the Chilocco Cemetery as she had no home. Very respectfully, S.M. McCowan, Superintendent. While classes were conducted within a traditional academic year, students would often stay year-round on the property. Students often participated in the outing system, a brainchild of Richard H. Pratt. This system placed students with upstanding white families during the summer months. It was believed that accepting Native children into white Christian homes would show them how to live a civilized life. Over time, however, this system became little more than an opportunity for low-cost child labor. Some white families took advantage of the young women in their employ, assigning them additional chores and offering them little in way of exposure to the larger communities in which they were placed. Instances of abuse also occurred within the program. And while outings provided a change of environment, rarely did they provide relief from the restrictive and often punitive school nature.
Chilocco was a physically tough environment. There was incarceration in what they called the guardhouse, bread and water rations. There was disciplinary techniques like making somebody stand at attention for hours, in formation. Girls would talk about sometimes somebody would faint.
Despite the tough military environment, there was social life for the students. The school had athletics, a band, and Saturday dances. Sundays, church attendance was required.
Some students who had not been raised in those Christian traditions were quite resistant to that, my dad among them. There were underground practices of Native religious traditions at Chilocco. They had students had a very elaborate communication system, passing notes, a highly developed slang, kind of their own little language, ways and means to subvert school authority.
Many students went years at Chilocco without seeing home. Some students resisted the boarding school environment by running away.
Well, I think we can all imagine how difficult it was for families, for parents and loved ones to see their children, their grandchildren, their nieces and their nephews taken away from them for extended periods of time. Some parents resisted. Other parents saw schools like Chilocco as at least some kind of opportunity for an education that might help their children in the world. And so they were very reluctant, as parents would be, to not have their children with them, but they balanced that against what they saw as the potential benefits.
In 1928, a harsh report, referred to as the Merriam Report, or the Problem of Indian Administration, criticized the government's Indian schools. It cited unsanitary living conditions, overcrowding, malnutrition, rigid discipline, and poor education. Several student and faculty accounts from the early days confirm the report's findings. The Merriam Report would provide the foundation for much-needed reform in Indian education, and it would usher in the next chapter of Chilocco's history, which many refer to as the Golden Years. With the stock market crash of 1929 and the arrival of the Great Depression, the United States found itself in an era of turmoil and uncertainty. Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected president on a platform of reform that would also benefit federal Indian policy. Roosevelt's Commissioner of Indian Affairs, John Collier, helped craft the Indian Reorganization Act in 1934, intended to stop native land loss and restore self-governance by Native Americans. This act, along with reforms triggered by the Merriam Report, would play out at Chilocco with varying degrees of success over the next 30 years.
When I think of Chilocco, I think of L.E. Carell.
Lawrence E. Carell became the superintendent of Chilocco in 1926. Carell was an educated man with a background in agriculture, respected by students and staff.
And I think he was sincere in building character and excellence in those students. And I don't think I would be able to say all the positive things that I always say about Chilocco had he not been our superintendent.
During the Carell era, day-to-day life for students at Chilocco changed dramatically. The militaristic nature of the school's instruction, along with harsh disciplinary practices of old, gave way to a more humanistic approach. Consideration for student welfare became more pronounced. Under Carell, educational offerings were expanded to include 4 years of high school. Programs to teach Native history and lore were implemented, a departure from the school's earlier avoidance of Native subject matter. Despite these advances, the quality of education at Chilocco continued to trail public schools. Courses were often rudimentary to accommodate those who were non-English speakers. Many classes were segregated by gender.
I wish that they had a better educational system. When I went to Chilocco, there was no homework. I was in the old age whenever they were still separating boys and girls subjects. The girls couldn't take math because that was a boys' class. And we got the credentials of being educated, even if we didn't get the education of it.
The Merriam Report had called for classes that served the individual abilities, interests, and needs of the students. But in Native American boarding schools, this was largely interpreted to mean vocational training. This vocational focus suited L.E. Correll, who turned Chilocco into a premier agricultural school.
I was not an agriculture student, but the Chilocco grads who majored in agriculture were probably 50% ahead of any farmer you want to pick out there who's farming right now. They knew more, they could probably make more money on their farm than their neighbors.
Correll instituted courses in horticulture, crop treatment, soil management, and animal husbandry. His soil and erosion control program was adopted by Oklahoma A&M. Correll also started a plot program, which allowed students to learn and earn at the same time, raising their own individual crops on school land and selling them for a profit. Animal husbandry was another important agricultural program. Under Correll, the school acquired a herd of Morgan horses, and soon its breeding program became the largest in the world. Chilocco also raised record-making herds of dairy that improved livestock herds throughout Oklahoma and southern Kansas. Numerous outside schools sent representatives to Chilocco to learn about their stock raising. These and other vocational programs helped many Chiloccoans have successful careers after they left the school.
One of the trades I thought was very progressive was printing. They had linotype operator. Of course, that's old stuff, but you had to have that if you were going to have a print shop. And there were a lot of guys who took printing. They printed our papers, the little Chilocco journals that we had. There was another guy who took baking. He was from North Carolina. When he went back to North Carolina, he bought a donut shop, a small donut shop that he was working in, and he became the founder of Krispy Kreme donuts.
After World War I, Chilocco's enrollment continued to climb. Additional employees were hired and new buildings were added. These included a women's gymnasium, which later housed the Navajo program, an accelerated track to help Navajo students with little or no schooling become fluent in English. These students would graduate from the 8th grade within 3 years. In addition to 4 hours of classwork and 4 hours of vocational training, students contributed to the daily running of the school through their work details. They handled the food preparation and laundry services, the feeding and grooming of livestock, and the repairs of machinery.
First of all, I was impressed with the greenery and the immaculate groundskeeping that somebody did. There was an oval at the center of the campus, around which all the buildings were built. And there was a water fountain with a fish pond in the center of it.
They kept the grounds up very well. We couldn't walk on the grass. If we did, we would be restricted. And in the spring, we had lilacs blooming, baby's breath, or wedding veil, roses, and it was just beautiful.
But the most iconic sight was always the poplar-lined Chilocco Drive with its imposing iron entryway.
The arch. This is a landmark that is forever burned into my heart. is that arch.
Despite the constant chores, or perhaps because of them, students treasured the rare spare time they had. Whenever they could escape outside, they would make small fires and parch corn, maybe organize a stomp dance or drum practice, or simply play games. From the 30s onward, boys and girls were allowed to eat together at lunch and mingle more freely.
The one thing that I remember is that we had fun. I've heard stories about Indian schools quite to the contrary. And it must have been miserable for some of those early students. It was like heaven to us.
For entertainment, students could attend movies at Hayward Hall, though they had to pass through a line of matrons to do so and sit with the matrons nearby in the movie. Saturday night dances were another memorable activity, and many a Chilocco marriage was ignited on the dance floor.
We had to dress up to go to the dances. The students learned to waltz and foxtrot, and then when rock and roll came, all of those.
Chilocco's athletic program expanded during this era because Ellie Correll felt that athletics were important for building character. Chilocco boxers were among the best in the nation, earning the school national and international attention. The team made several appearances at the Chicago's World Fair and won several Golden Glove matches in the 1930s.
We always had a champ who represented Oklahoma by going to the national Golden Gloves. To be a national champ, you had to win the state. And then you went to Chicago, where the West, they called Chicago the West, fought the East. That was New York City. And most of the time, the West won the tournament, the national tournament. I guess because we had so many Indian schools that had boxers.
Chilocco students competed in football, baseball, and many other sports. There was a pep squad and marching band that accompanied teams to games.
We had a pretty large band. We had a drum major and had twirlers, nice uniforms. I think we marched at Guthrie and Tulsa and at the Arkalala in Arkansas City.
Maintaining such a large campus required high enrollment at the school, so a recruitment program was launched to bring in students to Chilocco from other parts of the country. By the 1930s and 40s, Chilocco's student body was made up of many tribes, coming from as far away as Alaska. Despite this intertribal mixing, cliques still played a big role on the campus. Conflicts notwithstanding, the shared experience of Chilocco bridged many tribal rivalries and helped bring students closer together.
Chilocco had high standards, and they taught you those standards. And they had all the different tribes to come together and live together and get along and learn about each other and make friends with each other.
Many of the intertribal bonds and friendships formed at Chilocco and other Indian schools would ultimately lay the groundwork for the Native activist movements to come in the 1960s and 70s. Chilocco was unique among Indian schools in having its own National Guard Center. Company C was established in 1925 with 75 students and one non-Indian officer. The ability to earn extra money with the Guard while still attending school was a strong incentive to joining.
When you went to a drill, you were given credit for some money. When you went to Fort Sill, you were paid active duty rate for your grade for 2 weeks. That's income you would not have otherwise.
Company C of Chilocco began active duty in World War II on September 16, 1940, when Oklahoma's 45th Division was mobilized. They saw action in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. 35 students lost their lives, including Henry Nollatubby, the first American Indian killed in the war. Ironically, according to many Chilocco veterans, the hardship and discipline of boarding school helped them adjust to the military better than their public school counterparts. Chilocco produced 2 Medal of Honor winners during World War II, Lieutenant Ernest Childers, Muskogee Creek, and Lieutenant Jack Montgomery, Cherokee. The women also did their part. They wrote letters to their classmates turned soldiers and marched in the 3rd Liberty Loan Drive in Arkansas City, Kansas to promote war bonds. Because Chilocco offered clerical classes, its female students were prepared to answer the government's call for support staff during the war. Civilian students at Chilocco also contributed to the war effort. Some took classes in sheet metal welding and riveting school to furnish the Army with needed supplies. Upon graduation, these students possessed a set of valuable skills that could be used by the defense industry. Students also collected scrap metal and worked longer hours in the school's fields and gardens to raise additional food for the soldiers. During the Korean War, Chiloccoans served in the 279th Infantry of the 45th Thunderbird Division. They chose as their mascot the infamous Charlie doll, a well-known caricature of the so-called savage Indian, and placed it on their guidon. The men were known as the Charlie Company because of the doll. This stereotypical image of Indianness became a symbol of resistance, a proclamation of real Indians ready for the fight. In 1966, the Chilocco unit was discontinued and moved off campus. It is now located in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma.
We can point to almost 70% of our male students are veterans, having joined the armed forces at one point in their life. And then when you look at this figure and then you see the number of females who have joined the military, then Chilocco made a vast contribution.
Throughout the 60s, Chilocco would continue evolving and making reforms. However, following the 1969 Kennedy Report, which called out ongoing failures of federal Indian education, the school, which had been celebrated for many of its achievements, would experience a change of fortune. In 1969, on a wave of social and political upheaval, the United States Senate released the Kennedy Report, detailing how national and federal policy had failed Native students in public schools and boarding schools. But despite their troubled histories, it's also suggested that Indian boarding schools could be transformed into sites of innovation and change. Innovation became the guiding principle of Jim Baker, the first Chilocco alumnus to serve as superintendent of the school in 1974.
Nowhere in Oklahoma has a year-round program ever been carried out. Chilocco was the first. This allowed some students to come in and attend classes 12 months out of the year. And if they did this beginning with their freshman year, then they could technically graduate in 3 years. The other changes that we instituted had to do with opening up our system so that students had the freedom to select a program that they maybe wanted to try, wanted to learn. And a good example of that was opening up our vocational programs to both boys and girls. It didn't matter whether it was auto mechanics. We allowed girls to enroll in auto mechanics, vocational agriculture.
Even before Baker's arrival, Chilocco's student body had been undergoing great change.
But the biggest drop was the enrollment, because by then, a lot of the tribes who had been sending their students from Arizona and Alaska and up in the Northwest were better able financially to educate them at home, and of course that's what they wanted to do. So we didn't have as many coming. Times had just changed everywhere, but mostly after I went back there, they were hardship placements. Kids that were not functioning well in the places where they were, who were in some trouble, considered relatively minor at the time, where they could have a better opportunity. But it was not the same. It was very, very different, and I was saddened when I went back. But there were some wonderful students there. You know, they were just fewer and fewer and fewer. And of course, the cost per student was just out of sight.
Back in Washington, Congress was pressuring the Bureau of Indian Affairs to make cuts in expenditures. One area being targeted was Native American boarding schools. Senator Henry Bellman from Oklahoma, a budget hawk, voiced support for closing a number of schools, including Chilocco. This upset some residents of northern Oklahoma, who enjoyed the jobs and commerce the school provided. By contrast, some area farmers who saw Chilocco as a competitor supported the proposed closure.
If you have the partnership with an institution like Oklahoma State University that is helping you maybe do some testing with, let's say, wheat, it eventually gets its own name, and then you sell your wheat for $3.50 a bushel, and then the local farmer is only able to get $2.50 a bushel, then, you know, it becomes a subject.
Rumors that Chilocco was on the chopping block were already circulating when the unfortunate death of a student in a fight propelled Chilocco into crisis. While attorneys argued whether the crime should be prosecuted in tribal or civil court, the Bureau of Indian Affairs launched an investigation. As newspapers covered the story, negative publicity added to the fears that Chilocco would be closed. Area tribal leaders, whose students benefited most from the school, added their voices to the chorus, urging the government to keep its doors open. But advocates were swimming against the tide. Public sentiment towards Indian boarding schools had shifted. One factor was increased awareness of boarding school harms. Another was the passage of the Indian Education Act of 1973. This act made the public schools a more welcoming place for Native American students by encouraging cultural programming and the hiring of more Native teachers and counselors. Finally, many Chilocco graduates, in particular, had returned to their home communities with skills to earn a good living. Unlike their parents' generation, this gave them the option to keep their children in local schools, which they themselves helped shape as educators and activists. When the official announcement came in December 1979 that the spring graduating class would be the last, many students felt betrayed. Alumni and students organized, circulating petitions, writing letters to Congress, and holding Save Our School rallies. Having existed for nearly a century, the school had grown into much more than simply a place to learn.
The campus meant so much to so many people. It was their home.
I did find a better life by going to Chilocco. I always wondered today where I might be if I didn't go there.
In May 1986, the Kaw, Tonkawa, Pawnee, Ponca, and the Oto-Missouri nations were designated trustees of the school. Parts of the school were leased to different organizations over the years, but campus buildings, once known for their stately beauty and grandeur, declined.
Unfortunately, the Chilocco campus today is not what we had hoped it would be. And, you know, I say this with sometimes tears in my eyes, because the campus today is, you know, it's crumbling. So when you see all of this, you know, you ask yourself, why? what could I do? What can I do?
Restoring key buildings and maintaining the legacy of Chilocco is one goal of the Chilocco National Alumni Association, which is sustained by several chapters located in different parts of the country. The Alumni Association holds regular meetings, publishes a newsletter, and organizes the annual reunion, a tradition that began in 1894 with Chilocco's first graduating class and championed by Golden Years Superintendent Ellie Correll.
He encouraged those who were graduating to come back every year at the end of last weekend in May. We'll be here. Come back, he said, and tell us what you've been doing. That weekend was turned over to alumni activities, and it was very reassuring and inspiring in a way. You heard the stories about the guy that was, flying for the airlines, and about the one who had this good job. There were lots of distinguished Chilocco graduates.
Reunion activities have come to include the memorial walk through the arch, the powwow, veterans breakfast, and awards banquet. In 2018, for the first time, participants gathered for a ceremony at the school's cemetery, where so many Native children were buried during Chilocco's early years. By and large, however, the reunion is a joyous occasion, a time for catching up with old friends and reflecting upon Chilocco.
Man, I tell you, it's helped me through life with no end. I can get a job anywhere I want to, just by being able to go to school here. You not only learn a little bit of one trade, you learn the tricks of the trade, a little bit about everything, how to do all kinds of work,
You come to see the place, and it stirs up old memories of this and that. And a lot of the buildings are gone or almost ruined, but memories remain just as if it were yesterday, right? Or even right now. It was a huge part of my life, and whether I admit it or not, I think I was able to learn some good lessons here. I learned some skills. I learned how to deal with people in a certain way, and learned a lot about the outside world. It was a good experience. It had its bad moments, but that's life, right? I mean, not everything works out well on a daily basis, hourly basis, but good times, bad times. I tend to remember about this place just as much as the good times as the bad. So it's a part of my life, so it has to be important, right?
Right.
I can't define it.
In 2006, the Chilocco campus was added to the National Register of Historic Places. The Alumni Association hopes this designation will eventually lead to the creation of a cultural center at the campus, and perhaps a museum dedicated to the Charlie Company. Since its founding, Chilocco Indian Agricultural School has been known as the Light on the Prairie. In early days, its kerosene lanterns could be seen from miles away by travelers in covered wagons adrift in a sea of darkness. In the 30s, when electricity was installed, pilots flying over the campus at night used the illuminated campus as a visual landmark. Students, faculty, or staff heading toward the school after dark were guided to their destination by a light in the water tower. Today, the lights of Chilocco still burn in the hearts of alumni as they and their descendants work to preserve their school's unique heritage.